So Sean has muted everyone, and when the time comes, you will be able to unmute yourself, but you'll have to do it yourself. So let me start. I'm delighted to welcome you to this climate series. I'm Rod Downing from Vancouver, BC, Canada, the west coast of Canada. And today's topic is engaging the faith community. Now, we always start with the simple, the simple overall goal of this series, which is to move the needle from our current destructive patterns toward a sustainable flourishing of life for all. That's our vision. Secondly, given the focus of our church on the peaceable kingdom and also on following Jesus, the peaceful one, we note that the intimate connection, that the peaceable kingdom is only possible within a flourishing ecosystem. Now, each month from last fall through to this summer of 2021, we are hosting a monthly presentation by an expert followed by a conversation given twice. In November, we started off with Dr. Richard Gammon, a climate scientist who shared the basic science behind the climate crisis, and then returned in January to sketch some of the things we can do personally and on a bigger scale. And many of you attended that. Today's session is about engaging the faith community. And today's awesome panel really doesn't need an introduction, but I will at least mention the people and their basic position. First of all, we have Ron Harmon, who is president of the Council of 12. We have Katie Harmon-McLaughlin, World Church Spiritual Formations Facilitator. Zach Harmon-McLaughlin, who is the director of our seminary. And Emily Rose, who just moved from California. So wonderful that she finally got settled in, where she did an MDiv from Claremont, worked for the church, and specific to today is did some training on advocacy. Final thing to note is there is actually a family connection, and I'm simply mentioning that because that will be used. Katie is the daughter of Ron. Zach, of course, is married to Katie, and Emily is the niece of Ron. And they will have a bit of a family connection later on, so that's why I mention it. Now, as you can see on this slide, there are two identical sessions given on February 18 and 21st, where we go deeper into today's topic. So we hope you can make one of them. You will be sent a Zoom link for each of them, and you can join both of them if you would like. Finally, be sure to check our website for schedules, details. We have the archives of every video session we've done, and for action items. The link for this website is also in all the emails that you receive. Finally, we are grateful for the Greater Pacific Northwest Mission Center for sponsoring this series. So let's get started. Now, the one task you have to do other than to listen is to write any questions in the chat as the session proceeds. You can send that either to everyone or directly to Dean and Susie White. And finally, immense thanks to this amazing panel for sharing their gifts with us And with that, over to you, panel. I'm going to mute.
Thanks, Rod. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening to some, perhaps, depending on where you're joining us. My name is Zach. I'm going to just make sure, can I get a thumbs up from you if you can? Okay, good. Sometimes Zoom can be a bit goofy, and so I always like to start with a bit of grace to make sure that everything is working the way it is supposed to work. So it is by no mistake that I am starting this panel this morning. They decided that I was the worst candidate of the four of us on the panel, so they thought they'd get me done and out of the way first, naturally saving our very best for last, which is the incredible Emily Rose, who is my sister-in-law, actually, in our family. So what we want to do today is we were thinking about climate change and the various different perspectives that Ron and Katie, myself and Emily bring to the table here. While the four of us hold many things in common, we all actually have very different ways of engaging in this topic. But the more we talked about it, the more we shared with one another, the more we wanted to kind of bring a cohesive perspective to our sharing today through a process called the Pastoral Spiral. And you're going to see many of us refer to this book, which is Social Analysis for the 21st Century by Maria Simperman. You'll notice at the bottom of the screen that's being shared, there is a citation there so you can, get all of the information you'd like if you'd like to check that book out. We're going to go through that pastoral spiral today as we talk about climate change. In particularly, we're going to kind of tie in an example that we can nuance throughout the cycle, the spiral today, just to give as an example, which will be our family's take on food ethics. We all eat differently. No one has an agenda here to convince you not to eat in a certain way or to eat in another way. But we're going to kind of use food ethics as a way to connect the dots, not only to the pastoral spiral, but also to climate justice and why we care about that. So that's where we're going to go. We're going to break down this process for you. We're going to give you an opportunity to experience this. And it's a way, really, that we can actively engage in social transformation. And this is a pretty standard methodology for those in the academic world who are engaging in social change and social transformation. So that's where we're going to go. And I wanted to start in particular today with this quote from Maria Simperman in her book, because if you're anything like me, you're going to resonate with this. She says this: while we say we want these difficult problems and situations resolved, we usually mean that we want to have the problem solved without any significant changes on our part or in our way of life. Can I get an amen? Is this resonating with you? Right? Like, yes, we get climate change is tough, but man, do I like all of my single-use plastics because they're so convenient and really easy to do, right? Or I know I should take my coffee mug to Starbucks when I go to get a coffee, but I forgot, whatever it is, right? So we always have these various feelings about this. What I love about the pastoral spiral, though, is that it really breaks down a way to not only engage with our encounter with the sacred and our specific experiences that shape our understanding and perspective, it also helps us break down our biases, our assumptions, our sometimes siloed lens of how we approach a problem. But this might be the best reason to talk about this cycle today. And this is the reason. Climate change is overwhelming. It is massive. It is something that people have been talking about for decades, and the problem persists. The greatest minds in the world have tried to solve this problem, and the problem persists. And so if you're like me again, then when you get overwhelmed, you do this. Oh no, right? And you kind of retreat. The pastoral spiral enables us to focus, get specific, and enact tangible and sustainable change. It is by nature a way that we can engage and transform a situation. So you'll see on your screen the basic outline of the pastoral spiral. It begins with experience, which is what I'm going to talk about briefly. It moves into social analysis. Ron is going to talk to us about social analysis, into faith reflection. Katie's going to talk to us about faith reflection, and then back into action, and Emily Rose is going to talk to us about action. While these are 4 separate steps, it is important to notice that it is not ending, right? This is a cycle. Sometimes it's helpful to think of this cycle as a Venn diagram, that each piece overlaps the other. And to focus and create sustainable, meaningful change, each piece has to work cohesively with the other. And so sometimes in that very center part where you see it saying pastoral spiral, sometimes I like to delete pastoral spiral and put incarnation. When we engage with these things fully and meaningfully, we literally begin to embody, or as Doctrine and Covenants 164:9d reminds us, embody and live the passion and concern of Christ. So this is the basic spiral. We're going to kind of work our way through this, but give us an opportunity to look at climate change through a tangible way of engaging with a specific, focused experience we have. So we're going to start with experience, and this is our beginning place. This is our entry point into the process. A basic question to help you unpack your own experience here is, what causes you to have care about climate change? Why are you interested in this topic? What is it that brought you to a place of wanting to engage this? Each one of us are going to have a different entry point, right? Perhaps for you, it was going to a certain part of your community and seeing the city dump and thinking, how can this be? What is going on here? Or perhaps for some of you, it was going to your local congregation and drinking coffee out of a styrofoam cup and saying, I think we can do something different, right? Whatever your entry point, your experience or encounter is, that's where we begin. And the experience part is important because we begin to ask the questions of why. We explore our stories and begin to unpack and uncover what's most important to us. Maria Simperman says this about the pastoral spiral, which is really helpful in terms of approaching such a big, complex, radical issue such as climate change, particularly as we talk about food ethics and all the various issues related to and intersections of food ethics. She says this about using and engaging the pastoral spiral in order to create social change or social transformation in your context. Participants in the pastoral spiral have realized that they are not just out there as observers, but that they can play a role in making a difference, however small or large, for both the people and the earth. There is a process to be used, a process that can reframe realities for us, transform all involved, and be a concrete response to the gospel call to participate with God in bringing about the reign of God. That's a powerful idea there. This idea that when we begin to work this spiral, asking the questions, uncovering biases and assumptions, reflecting on where God is at work in the midst of us, and finding simple, tangible ways to act on the insights that emerge and ways in which we can create community, transforms everything. So I'm going to begin us this morning or this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are, with a simple practice. So I'm going to invite you to get comfortable in your chair wherever you are, and I want you to look at this gorgeous tomato on your screen. I want you to really, really look at it. So get comfortable for a second. We're going to take a few moments and just sit in silence. And as we sit in silence, I want you to stare at the tomato. What is it that you see? What do you smell? What else do you see? What's it remind you of? When you look at the tomato, what is it that you see? Keep looking. Notice everything that enters your mind as you stare at the tomato. Now, because I want to make sure that my colleagues on our panel today have enough time to share their brilliant insight and wisdom, I'm going to rush this process just a touch. Usually, I would invite us to share in small groups and spend time reflecting on what was it that you saw when you looked at this tomato. And this is important to the process, and it's important to climate change, because what we're going to begin to notice is that there is so much more to see. I'm going to read a poem, and I want you to continue to stare at the tomato as I read this poem. And I almost invite you to hear this poem as a prayer. If you are a poet, you will see clearly that there is a cloud floating in this tomato. Without a cloud, there will be no rain. Without rain, the tomato plants cannot grow. And without tomato plants, we can have no tomatoes. The cloud is essential for the tomato to exist. If we look even more deeply into the tomato, we can see the sunshine in it. Without the sunshine, the tomato fields cannot grow. And so we know that sunshine is also in this tomato. And if we continue to look, we see the farm worker who picked the tomato and brought it to the trucks to be driven to the agribusiness corporation who will send it into the processing plants for food franchises. And then we will see wheat and beans. The farm worker cannot exist without his daily tortillas and beans. And therefore the wheat and beans that became his meal are also in this tomato. The farm worker's father and mother, wife and children are too in it. And we will see people marching in the streets to proclaim the farm workers' rights in a nation torn apart over issues of migration. Only one of many wealthy nations as global migration flows reach historic levels. As your contemplative vision deepens, you see the farm workers and the fields, the planet itself threatened by pesticides and fertilizers that permeate them. And you will know in the very fiber of your being that the tomatoes, the farm workers, the fields, the families, the social movements, and the planet are all held in the suffering love of God. So when we engage in this process of the pastoral spiral, as we move through this presentation today, looking at food ethics and how we can make a sustainable, tangible change in a small, particular way in this vastly complex issue, we notice that this is not just a tomato. It never was just a tomato. And so our experience into this pastoral spiral begins with the tomato. So when you begin this process of the pastoral spiral, it starts with experience. And experience is important because we always have to begin with what we know, not the assumption of what we don't know, or the pretense or pretending of what we don't know. Simperman says, an issue that affects us often stimulates our initial interest and gives us the energy to pursue a project seriously. Have you ever noticed that about yourself? It's those things that grab you, that pull you, that call your attention. I like to call these burning bush moments, right? The things where you drop the sheep as if there were no care in the world. You turn to the side and run to the burning bush to see how you might respond. So experience always begins with the places that we know, our own stories, which leads us into narratives and data. And really, you could replace narrative with story here, if you'd like. Stories move us. I had a professor in college, Dr. Barbara Mesley, who used to say, arguments never change people's opinions. Stories do. Never have more true words been spoken, perhaps. Simperman says this about narratives and the power of narratives. Narratives grab us. They remind us that real people are involved in the issues at hand, just like the farm workers, the families, the communities of the tomato. Narratives also remind us that the earth too is part of God's creation and needs people to act in solidarity on her behalf. So when we tell stories, when we share our stories, it expands our understanding, meaning it expands what we know. It's important to experience in this part of the process that we name what we know, that we don't simply just pass through it cavalierly, but we name it. And we ask why. And Simperman actually has this test of the whys. We say, why do I feel this way about X? And why does X make me feel this way about X? And why does that make me feel this way about that? And why does this make me, right? And she just keeps asking the why. And you continue to go deeper and deeper into our understanding of our encounter or experience that has moved us into action. I like to call these Luke 5 moments, going into the deep. I could toss scripture out here all day. I love this. And then the last and perhaps most important part of experience, and perhaps the most important part of this entire pastoral spiral method, is this: who is still needed? Who's not at the table who needs to be at the table? How am I making sure that my own experience, my own story is not tied into my own identity, my own bias, and my own privilege? How am I making sure I'm pushing the boundaries of what it is that I see to be reality? This makes sure that our experiences don't hold us hostage in a silo, but rather invite us deeper into a broader reality that impacts not only ourselves, but our community and the planet. As we begin to work this process of experience and go deeper into our experience, it begins to shed some of the layers that allows us to then move beyond ourselves into the next part of this process, which is social analysis. I'm going to end my time with a slide that has a question on it. The question is actually the same as the questions that are on your handout you should have or will be receiving from Rod. And we're going to end each one of our presentation sections today with a screen highlighting the social or the pastoral spiral with about a minute of reflection, just to take time to think about our process. So as I draw my part of our time this morning, or our time this afternoon, to a close, I'm going to just leave the screen up for about 30 seconds to a minute in silence and allow us to reflect on the experience section of this pastoral spiral. The question is this: what issues related to climate change emerge in your context and out of your experience?
So I'm going to invite us to take a look at social analysis as part of the pastoral spiral. It's good to be with you today. I was in my late 40s when, as a family, we decided to meet in Colorado for a week of hiking in the fresh mountain air. In addition to the challenges of the high elevation, I realized that week just how out of shape I had become. We'd hiked some beautiful trails, and each one for me was a significant physical struggle just to make it to the end of the trail. While on the trail on our last day of hiking, I had one of those rare moments when everything comes into sharp focus. In addition to taking in the beauty of the trail and soaking in the deep meaning of being together as a family, I'd also been reading this book by Caldwell Esselstyn, a cardiologist and author of Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease. The book provided years of peer-reviewed research and data outlining the benefits of a plant-based diet. The results were stunning on the effects of a plant-based diet and overall health, and paralleled other landmark studies like the China study. As I was hiking and taking in all the beauty of that experience and enjoying being together as a family, I had this realization. I want to be able to hike with my adult children and their children well into my later years in life. I had this deep feeling in the center of my being of the rightness of this realization. I sensed a deep connectedness in that moment to the earth, relationships with my family, and my physical and mental and emotional well-being. I knew I had to take action. We traveled home, true story, and the next day, I began my vegan lifestyle. I went cold turkey, or maybe I should say cold broccoli, on both meat and dairy. It was one of the most difficult life changes I have ever made. And for the first 6 months, I was not a happy vegan. But it has been 8 years since that decision. And I can say for my health, it has been a game changer. Now, I'm not here to convince all of you to become plant-based eaters, although I wouldn't mind taking a crack at that. If you want to explore that with me sometime, I'm always happy to share my experience and some research. What started out primarily as a health decision has evolved over the years to become so much more. A deeply theological and, for me, a values-based decision, grounded in our vision as captured in our church seal found in Isaiah 11. A vision where humanity and creation live in a new relationship. As the scripture envisions, they will neither harm nor destroy on my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. I came to realize over time the many dimensions of my decision that day and how they were all connected. They form the basis of what we call social analysis. In Maria Simperman's social analysis in the 21st century, she outlines the following dimensions of analysis that you will see on this slide that Zach brought up at just the right time. Sociological, economic, political, cultural, environmental, and religious. The 6 dimensions of social analysis. My initial experience in the mountains of Colorado was my entry point, as Zach had referred to in terms of our experience. It led to an action to become vegan initially due to health, but I soon recognized there are many more dimensions to the potential of a plant-based diet as a sustainable step for our planet. Now, when I use the word sustainable, I ask this simple question. If every person lived like I did or adopted my lifestyle decisions, would it be sustainable for our planet? And of course, you can explore the impact of these kinds of personal decisions using tools like the Nature Conservancy Calculator, which I understand has been referenced in previous sessions. It's a great tool to begin to get a sense of how your decisions really make a difference on the sustainability of the planet. I've been significantly influenced by the work also of Jeffrey Sachs and his landmark book, The Age of Sustainable Development, which I would also highly recommend. In his section on climate, he discusses the importance of reducing CO2 emissions to keep the total increase of the Earth's temperature below the limit of 2 degrees Celsius. Since we've already increased by approximately 1 degree, time is of the essence. One other brief definition from Sachs that I found helpful as we begin to apply the pastoral spiral to the challenge of climate change. What is sustainable development as a holistic vision of what a good society should be? Sachs suggests we need to shift the paradigm from a purely transactional-based view on economics to a society that is not only economically prosperous, but also one that is socially inclusive, environmentally sustainable, and well governed. Well, we could spend days unpacking these three essential elements, but I want us to think about how we together might begin to create this new norm as we look briefly at social analysis. What is economically prosperous, environmentally sustainable, and well governed, where we don't settle for trade-offs, where there are winners and losers, but develop new creative synergies in the pursuit of efficiency, equity, and sustainability, informed by our living faith. This in many ways incorporates the heart of social analysis, paired with theological reflection in our pastoral spiral. So what we are doing with this process is analyzing a question or issue, like the benefits of a plant-based diet, to discern possible futures and to risk bold actions for the common good. Social analysis, as that second step in this approach, is a method by which one, according to Simperman, looks at an issue in order to see its individual parts and its entirety. Social analysis asks, what are the structures and dynamics at work, creating the situation we are experiencing as it currently exists? In our case, we're exploring the many dimensions of climate change in this series and what actions we can take to reverse the impact of CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions on the rise of global temperature. This multidimensional analysis also helps us unearth, if you will, our blind spots or biases so that we see clearly what is happening, why it is happening, and how it relates to our values and beliefs as disciples and communities of justice and peace. It's not an attempt to find facts that fit our narrative or preconceived vision of reality, but it's an honest pursuit of the truth by seeking out credible, peer-reviewed qualitative and quantitative data and analysis, and the real stories of people impacted in understanding root causes and considering creative solutions. Again, according to Maria Simperman, our response will come from the results of our analysis, combined with reflection on the problem based on our faith and values, so that our action is directed to where the difficulties and problems are, where something in the system has shifted out of balance, or where we might intervene. What we are attempting in social analysis is to move away from the what, our experience that first increases our awareness, to the why. So in my experience of shifting to a plant-based eating approach, I've continued to explore two questions. Why may our current approach to eating be unsustainable for the planet? And would moving toward more plant-based eating be better for the planet? In the very brief time we have, I'm going to focus on just a few considerations of a plant-based diet and its potential impact on the environment using a few dimensions of social analysis. Maria Simperman provides very helpful questions under each of the 6 dimensions of social analysis you can apply to any issue, and you'll find these questions in chapter 4 of her book, Social Analysis for the 21st Century. So for example, just like our tomato example, our refrigerator is a good place to begin our exploration. It might seem like an unlikely place to begin the fight against global warming, but did you know that food is responsible for over 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions? Meat and dairy make up the vast majority of that carbon footprint. A United Nations study reports that farmed livestock accounts for 14.5% of all man-made greenhouse gas emissions, with cow burps a surprisingly big culprit. That's right, you heard it here first, cow burps. Friends, did you know the world has a lot of cows? More than 1.5 billion. And every day, US slaughterhouses turn nearly 20,000 of them into steaks, hamburgers, and roast beef. But before they become beef patties, each cow spends a lifetime chewing grub and burping greenhouse gases. Well, before this discussion of cow burps digresses any further, let's return to our 14.5% of greenhouse gases emitted by farm livestock. To put that in perspective, the BBC reported that this is roughly equivalent to the exhaust emissions of every car, train, ship, and aircraft on the planet. If we all went vegan, the world's food emissions, the 14.5% total of all emissions, could drop by 70% by 2050, according to a recent report on food and climate in the journal Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. The study's authors from Oxford University put the economic value of these emission savings at upward of 400 billion. Wow, that sounds great, right? Hey, let's all become vegans, and we can today begin reducing all those cow burps. Well, of course, it's a bit more complex than that. So let's pause here and think about the economic dimension of plant-based versus a meat-based lifestyle. It gets complicated, and I can only touch on the surface in the time that we have. I start here because this tends to be the driver of most decisions in our society, right? Economics, and has a huge impact on politics as a dimension of social analysis. So let's just look at one question: who benefits and who is disadvantaged if things change? You can see the list of other questions included under this dimension of social analysis on the slide that, once again, Zach has timed perfectly. In economic analysis, we're looking at the flow of resources and money between people and organizations. So let's go back to our potential 70% reduction in food-related emissions if we go plant-based. Before we get too excited, it's not clear if this study took into account the creation of greenhouse gases as a result of processing plant-based food, like soybeans, for example. You know, soybeans, which are found in so many plant-based foods, great source of protein, but the processing of these soybeans results in greenhouse gases. Studies show there's less processing actually required of meat than many plant-based foods, meaning less greenhouse gases in the production process. So maybe our 70% reduction is only 50%. Still, this is significant, but an example of how we need to examine the data carefully. In addition, it'd be good to find out who sponsors or funds the various studies that we're looking at as we do our analysis. Another whole dimension of this discussion is organic versus conventional farming. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, organic agriculture's CO2 emissions per acre are significantly less than those of conventional agriculture, but yields per acre are also generally lower and can offset the economic savings. So the strawberry you buy from a a local farmer might have a bigger environmental footprint than the strawberry you buy from one far away, where a large farm in an ideal climate may grow it more efficiently. But then again, it might not. Do you see the challenge? And there may be other environmental, sociological, economic, and cultural factors, all part of our social analysis, that make buying actually locally more compelling. For example, the concern about pesticides and various human disease, or supporting local organic farmers to make products more available locally. This is why we really have to be thoughtful in our analysis and decisions. For those who include meat as part of their diet, trying to eat responsibly really presents a genuine conundrum. What's the best for the planet is often what's worst for the animal. The efficiencies of the modern factory farm actually decrease greenhouse gases, but they also require the confinement of animals to very small spaces that most of us would consider inhumane. And if we're to shift significantly to more plant-based eating, what do we do about the economic impact to those who work in the livestock industry? Remember our economic questions above. What would we propose for those who would be disadvantaged economically by such a shift? In addition to the stories of those who make their living with livestock farming, we need to hear the stories of those who live in food deserts and economically depressed or remote areas, where access to whole and healthy vegetables and fruits is often challenging. What about the stories of those who don't make a living wage and struggle to afford fresh vegetables and fruits because other processed foods may be less expensive? If we go further in our analysis of environmental impacts as a dimension of social analysis, we might discover that current and anticipated changes in global weather patterns due to climate change already underway will make plant-based eating more challenging in certain regions of the world. The reality is, Barb and I struggle with each and every decision with respect to food. Sourcing of food, packaging of food, distribution of food, the carbon footprint of specific food choices, and all the dimensions of social analysis that we barely touched on in this short time. But that is the point, is it not? To be more thoughtful and intentional in our decisions. These questions and many more in each of the 6 dimensions are at the heart of social analysis. Before we move on, I want to hold up one more very important dimension of social analysis. Remember, this is a communal process. Group analysis and discernment are an essential part of information gathering. Regular gatherings, group conversation, exploration, vibrant, healthy conversation and dialogue, reflection, and the identification of emerging insights and trends are all central to this process. The pastoral spiral is predicated on our willingness to engage with others, to listen to their stories, and form relationships outside our faith communities, so that together we can creatively reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Social analysis provides this robust foundation to engage in theological reflection as we connect a solid understanding of the why with what it means for us as disciples and pursuers of Christ's vision. Let's now take a moment to reflect as Zach puts our question up on the screen for us. Briefly list some of the potential sociological, economic, political, cultural, environmental, or religious factors in your issue that invite you into deeper reflection and exploration.
Well, I wish we could give you more time to continue those reflections, but hopefully having the handout and references to the book will give you a place to turn if you desire to continue your explorations. And I just want to mention, I've been loving the conversation in the chat, all of the great questions and comments that have been coming up as we move through this cycle together. We're now moving into the next part of the pastoral spiral, which is faith reflection. And you can see on the screen the definition from Simperman of faith reflection is reflectively engaging scripture, tradition, mission statements, etc. And I want to invite us to begin with Psalm 24:1. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. So when I was a college student, there was one day that I was hurriedly making my way to class, running late, with a plastic bottle in my hand. Through the maze of people in the crowded student center was a recycle bin, but right next to me was the trash can. As I was about to casually toss my bottle into the trash to save those precious seconds to make it to class on time, I suddenly remembered a phrase, a mantra, a prayer from my class on ecological theology by Sally McFagg. The world is the body of God. The world is the body of God. It was one of those moments where everything just kind of slowed down. A thundering realization that I had a choice right then to live from integrity and faith or convenience and self-interest. 1,000 of these choices open before us each day, and for this one, I'm grateful that I was fully awake. I could almost feel the turning and opening of my heart as I walked to the recycle bin and ceremoniously held my bottle. I dropped it into the recycle bin like I was putting my offering in the plate, or in the way that I would reach for bread in communion. The simple turned sacramental because I could suddenly see how I was gifted with life on this sacred planet, and God was present in, through, and to it all. The world is the body of God. Repeat this phrase throughout your day and notice what it awakens, confronts, how it brings gratitude and delight. The world is the body of God. God is no further away than this plastic bottle, this recycle bin, this gentle turning of attention to the real. Of course, now I would do my best to avoid a plastic bottle at all, but that was over a decade ago, and we know that that's the nature of our growth in faith. There is much grace as we keep discovering ways to align our actions with the source of life and the well-being of creation. And truly from Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. The theological and spiritual insight that captured me in this moment of decision is an example of faith reflection, which is the next movement in the pastoral spiral. Faith reflection invites us into the deep resources of the Christian tradition. We hold what has been coming up from experience and social analysis into the light of our faith and the depth of the tradition. Simperman says we engage issues with our religious imagination, our creativity, and our openness to possibility. And other authors suggest that faith reflection is to allow the thoughts, feelings, images, and insights that arise from the concrete events of our lives to be in genuine conversation with the wisdom of the entire Christian community through the ages. I want to stress here that this is not an exercise in orthodoxy. It is not an obligatory way to make sure that we are being good Christians. It is a practice of encountering the vitality of a living tradition grounded in an experience of the living God. Wendy Farley observes that the difficulty and crisis of the world is overwhelming. And we might add the difficulty and crisis of climate disruption is overwhelming. It is virtually impossible to bear it without very deep resources. These deep resources of our faith are varied. And in this stage of the cycle, they could evoke reflection in many areas. They include scriptural stories, images, and themes, particular denominational statements and reflections, such as for Community of Christ, sacredness of creation, wisdom and stories from throughout Christian history, practices and prayer forms, and theological reflection to make explicit the connections between what we say we believe and what we actually live. In fact, one of the questions I saw in the chat about for what purpose were animals created? That's a great example of a theological question that I wish we could get into right now, but with some good exegesis and reflection, I think that we could find some really interesting responses to that question. These resources are not just to inform how we think, but also to be people formed in, by, and for God's vision of shalom, which is justice, peace, and wholeness for all creation. At this point in the pastoral spiral, we, in the words of Theophan the Recluse, descend with the mind into the heart. We not only engage our faith for right belief, but to see what it evokes in us, how it transforms us and aids us in discerning healing action aligned with God's will for the world. Maria Simperman reminds us that faith reflection is a crucial part of the process and also the one that many of us are tempted to skip or avoid. She writes, "We risk a superficial, short-term, and inadequate response if we bypass the process of faith reflection. The time spent on social analysis is a clear reminder that the issues we engage are complex and value-laden, requiring discernment because of overlapping and competing value systems. However, faith reflection helps us sift and sort through these quagmires, leading to a fuller and deeper response." One way to engage this practice, if you were moving through the pastoral spiral and you started with your experience and then you engaged in social analysis, is to take this as an opportunity first to pause and notice what has come up for you so far, to prayerfully hold what you have discovered and to weigh its significance, to bring it into conversation with the essence of our faith. Is there a biblical image of creation care that is evoked for you? A writing on ecological theology, a faith experience that you have had of encountering God in the natural world? In Community of Christ, we also have a great tool called the 6 lenses for discovering God's will. that invites us to engage pressing issues by seeing through the multiple but interrelated lenses of scripture, reason and knowledge, tradition, personal and community experience, continuing revelation, and common consent. To return to the issue of food ethics, which I can already sense is stirring many of us as a meaningful entry point, how might we engage the tradition to discern the yearning of the Spirit for our time? Part of my own food ethic can be summarized in a quote from Wendell Berry, who is also drawing from the wisdom and symbolism and theology of the Christian tradition when he writes these words. To live, we must daily break the body and shed the blood of creation. When we do this knowingly, lovingly, skillfully, reverently, it is a sacrament. When we do it ignorantly, greedily, clumsily, destructively, it is a desecration. I'll read that for us again. To live, we must daily break the body and shed the blood of creation. When we do this knowingly, lovingly, skillfully, reverently, it is a sacrament. When we do it ignorantly, greedily, clumsily, destructively, it is a desecration. It's a helpful practice for me for simple daily discernment. Is this choice, is this action sacrament or desecration of God's creation? I have been vegetarian for 12 years as an expression of my faith, and I live with a proud ethical omnivore. For me, it has been the best continued response to this discernment question. I know that eliminating meat intake and over-reliance on the industrial food system is one small way that I can reduce my own carbon footprint and also can honor the lives of creatures and live into the Isaiah vision of a peaceful creation. I desire to make choices each day that alleviate the suffering of creatures and creation. While I don't believe that becoming vegetarian is a faith imperative for everyone, so we can all take a deep breath, I do believe that it is one way that I can respond to climate change within the circumstances and the context of my life in a sustained way to align my deepest understanding of belief in the Christian tradition with action. What other choices might I make? How else might I approach what has come up from social analysis when I engage the wisdom of my faith, of our faith? Already in this very brief time together, we have engaged three sources of the tradition. First, theological reflection. The world is the body of God. Second, scriptural reflection. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. And third, a question of discernment using symbols and phrases from the tradition. Is this action sacrament or desecration? Many more resources are available to us. And in fact, one of the resources that you received is the brand new updated commentary on our basic belief of creation, edited by Anthony Chavala-Smith, which I highly recommend. It is packed full of rich material for ongoing faith reflection. Yet even just the three that are on your screen have sustaining power in our daily decisions and our longer term discernment on issues of climate justice. Our deeper engagement with faith stories, images, symbols, and experiences have the potential to transpose what we think into how we live. And this is what formation is all about. It deepens in us an integrity that becomes second nature. More than an intellectual exercise, faith reflection engages the heart, the source of transformation. We know that we have the information we need to address climate disruption. The question is, what will it take for us, the people of God, to have a change of heart, metanoia, to live the deepest convictions of our faith with integrity, passion, courage, and love? What very deep resources are available to us for this overwhelming, complex, and urgent time? Simperman says, faith reflection while ongoing is a contemplative process of engaging as we gaze. It requires an attentive receptivity and a desire to listen to the Spirit's invitation in response to the cries of our world today. People who seek to live this way offer a form of leadership that is deeply needed in the church and the world. This is possible only with openness, radical dependence on and availability to God, community, religious imagination, and insight that commits to act. Then the space opens up. When it does, we move to action, which is where we now turn. The space opens up, just as it did over a decade ago when a college student was hurriedly walking through a student center and made the choice to recycle because the urgent call of faith moved from head to heart. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and you who live in it. You are now invited to take a few moments to briefly notice what resources from our faith tradition are evoked for you. What images, scriptures, symbols, stories, or theological reflections are evoked that invite your deeper prayerful reflection as you engage your particular issue of climate disruption?
Thank you, Katie, for that reflection. We're going to move along now into our next part of the pastoral spiral, which is action. And I just want to take a minute and summarize a little bit of what we mean when we say action. So the first is that action is contextual. So after you have spent this time on the pastoral cycle, or spiral, and you have paid attention to your experience and you have looked at social analysis and you've deepened, taken that journey from your head into your heart with what you've learned. Now is this time where you can act, and that's going to look different in any faith community. Action is also part of the spiral. So again, what Zach said earlier is that this is not where it stops. This isn't a destination. This is actually just a next step on the spiral where we will again reflect on our experience and do the whole thing again. It keeps going. I also invite you to consider a posture of experimentation when you think about action. And when we talk about food ethics, you can experiment. What does it mean for me to try and have perhaps less meat in my diet, or for me to experiment with only eating local produce for one summer? So action is an informed experiment. It is not the final destination. And I hope that that helps you feel a sense of freedom and creativity in your faith communities. Go ahead, Zach. So action is connected to social analysis. So we revisit those lenses that we looked at earlier that Ron gave us. What actions, informed by analysis and theological reflection, can address the climate crisis using these lenses: sociological, economic, political, cultural, environmental, and religious. And as we've seen, just with one topic of food justice in response to the climate crisis, all of these different lenses intersect in so many ways, and it exposes how utterly interconnected we are. So the example that Ron gave, I really liked, that organic produce is obviously better for us, better for the planet, but it hits up against economic justice when those who can't afford organic produce or live in a food desert are prevented from engaging in that particular food. So again, it's complicated, but we revisit that social analysis when we take action. Go ahead, Zach. So you can take different kinds of actions. And again, we've been talking about some of our own personal responses to food justice. And you can think about that for yourself too, making personal food ethics choices that take into account what you've learned and discerned in your faithful reflection. For me, I started out as a vegetarian, primarily for environmental reasons, and also just, I don't know, my own learning led me there in college. And actually, my husband, Daniel, went vegan long before I did. And so I lived with a vegan and kind of learned about what that meant, and the cooking, journey that we took. And actually, I would say now, my personal, what I'm holding lately in personal food ethics, and especially in response to climate change, is that I have this deep desire for our produce to be grown in such a way that is healthy for the soil. So regenerative agriculture is what I have been trying to learn about lately, and that actually has a direct impact on climate or carbon drawdown. So even there's always another step to try and really pay attention to how we are eating and what that does to the earth. You might take action within your faith community. So what would it look like if at your congregation, I know we're all online now, but you planted a native pollinator garden after you have done this part of the spiral, or perhaps you have reusable mugs at coffee hour. You could consider having community dinners that make organic food available to those who otherwise wouldn't have access. And then there's this other element of action in the neighborhood that involves more organizing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second, but you could organize and support lasting changes to address climate change. Faith-rooted organizing is one particular example of that kind of action. All right. So faith-rooted organizing, I first came into contact with an organization called CLUE, which stands for Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice. And they are a group in Southern California. So for those of you who have joined us in the Southern California area, they are a wonderful faith-rooted organizing movement that actually walks along labor unions and fights for economic justice as their particular justice issue. But their model can be applied to all kinds of issues of justice. And so they've given this training that I love the definitions that they give. So this is from them. And this is to help you kind of understand the different models of action, none of which are necessarily right or wrong. We need all of them. But it's a helpful way of thinking how we could respond. So direct service is doing something for people. So that's giving people the fish. If you think of that old phrase, teach a man to fish, or give a man a fish he eats for a day, teach a man to fish, and he fishes or eats for a lifetime. Community development, or fishing, is people doing it for themselves. Organizing and advocacy means that we're removing the barrier around the pond. So we are holding systems accountable, and holding people who have power in those systems accountable to making changes that impact our lives. When we talk about faith-rooted organizing, that draws on the resources and divine call of faith to impact organizing and advocacy. if you go to the next slide, I've got a quick example of what that could look like in our conversation. So direct service would be perhaps a food pantry with organic local produce as one kind of climate conscious food justice response. Community development or fishing, you could, as a congregation, have a community garden where local families tend to their own plot to grow sustainable unorganic produce. And perhaps you're kind of addressing food deserts by doing that as well. Organizing an advocacy or removing that barrier would be to work to change laws or policies and institutions surrounding food production. So for example, there's an organization called Non-Toxic Neighborhoods, and their goal is to ban glyphosate in various neighborhoods. And there are entire counties in Southern California who have done this. Another example, organizing your community to change energy efficient or energy efficiency standard laws in your city. And that's actually going on in Kansas City right now. That's a way that you can use your voice. If you know anybody in Kansas City, that's a recent piece of legislation. So faith-rooted organizing would be then to weave in the resources of faith into advocacy. So in my own experience with Clue, what was really powerful is that we as faith leaders or lay leaders in faith movements took seriously our role in the community as the moral voice to really ring loudly so that those in power remember their own divine call. So it meant that we would walk alongside delegations of workers and as they would share their stories in various demonstrations or like conversations with management in their own struggles for justice, we as faith leaders would come and support them from behind and also share our own, why our own faith compels us to support workers and seeking justice. And so in the context of climate justice, really, we have this rich well, especially in our own tradition. I think Community of Christ is so well poised. We have this rich well of resources that gives us a vision of what God calls shalom that compels us and gives us what we need to sustain this kind of work. So that's kind of what I mean by faith-rooted organizing. I know it's just a really short snippet of it. And again, we're gonna have some more resources in some of our discussion at the next two sessions, but here's a little snapshot of faith-rooted organizing as an action. So kind of to close out, we're gonna have one more question for you to spend some time reflecting on, and then I think we will move to Q&A. So take a few minutes and silently reflect on what concrete actions do you envision flowing from the direction of social analysis and faith reflection?
All right, I think we're now moving to a fairly brief question and answer period. And I'm just going to pose questions that have been generated through the chat in various ways. And to start with, and I'm going to throw this out to any of you on the panel who want to address it. There's a well-known strain in American life of anti-intellectualism. So how is it that we can persuade people to change, especially when they are already convinced that they know what the truth is?
I think of the quote that Zach had from Barb Mesley, that story is what changes people. And my deep desire is that we have more authentic spaces for conversation and story sharing. Because it's pretty easy to get into our, echo chambers, but when we share stories with each other, and that's even been happening in the chat today of people who have different experiences and sharing stories.
Yeah, I would just echo what Emily shared. The first thing that I actually thought of when you shared that question, Dean, was to raise a voice of caution, which is this: don't try to change anybody. don't do that. And I don't mean there, to be passive or simply accept oppressive, marginalizing, diminishing behaviors or thoughts. So don't confuse what I'm saying. But what is really transformative, and Jesus teaches us this, what's really transformative is story and invitation. Rarely does Jesus go into a conversation with a directive to say, hey, you're bad, you're wrong, do this, everything's gonna be fine, right? Like that, there may be one, maybe two times where that happens. More often than not, Jesus reaches out his hand. He notices somebody's belovedness. And I think particularly with the Pastoral Spiral, what it really is about are these qualitative experiences that lead us to transformation. And Ron shared a statement that I think is really important here, which is transformation, not transaction. We're not trying to convince people of an agenda or a product. Rather, we're trying to invite people into transformational experiences that by nature of transformation, we come to a different way of being, a different way of understanding or seeing the world.
Okay. This may be a follow-on to that. Our leaders seem to be very much obligated to companies who are invested in fossil fuels and current methods of farming and construction. What's your recipe for getting our leaders to listen to a message of changing the practices that we follow?
I can jump in quickly on this one. I think that while we gave just a very brief snapshot of this pastoral spiral process today, what we've done is a great example of, I think, the kind of faith engagement that we can be using when we address any issue to deepen the theological and spiritual maturity of disciples throughout the church. Because, starting with, like how Zach started with experience, starting with our entry point, or what are those places of passion, helps us to connect to our stories. And then we move through this process without agenda, as though we're trying to press a certain outcome, but open, truly open to what is God's desired outcome in this situation, which is a very different standpoint than you need to do this. In fact, hopefully we've been clear that we're not saying it to anyone in this presentation, you need to be vegan, for example. We represent a diversity of eating ethics just within our own family, but use that as a thread to demonstrate how engaging this process authentically can lead to sustainable action in diverse ways, but hopefully in ways that represent the integrity and authenticity of our faith, our tradition, and our community. And so I would just say that I think this process is a great place to start for people who are asking that question. And I would highly recommend buying Maria Simperman's book and reading it if you're interested in engaging issues seriously from a faith perspective and deepening our maturity in theological reflection as disciples.
I'd also like to just quickly follow up with that. And I promise to my other colleagues on the panel, I'm not going to follow up every answer. But I think Katie said an important piece there, right? Which is, so I'm an omnivore, right? I love cheeseburgers. I was born and raised in Kansas City. I could eat barbecue till the cows come home, literally. So we do have this very diverse approach to food ethics in our family. But this is an important part of faith, and I think this is an important part of this, the spiral and why we're talking about it. We need to not really be focused on certainty or clarity, but our ability to dive deeply into ambiguity and ask questions, to really have the courage to push what we think we know into the uncertainty. And again, this is something that Jesus teaches us, and it's the maturing process. We grow by virtue of our willingness to ask questions. And so Ron, Katie, they each talked about Isaiah 11, our church symbol, a child, a lamb, and a lion. That symbol pushes my faith to say, can a world exist where Zach doesn't eat a cow? If I'm serious about the peaceable kingdom, does a world exist where I'm not a predator, but I am living in harmony? And that's a hard thing. I mean, I say that in jest here on this panel, but that deeply moves me and pushes me all the time. And so for me, this isn't so much the pursuit of certainty as much as it is the progression of hope. And so I'm always hoping that I find the courage to ask the harder and harder questions, to go deeper and deeper into exploration.
I just wanted to briefly add, I think one of our challenges right now in a highly polarized environment that we find ourselves in is, I think we have to start by asking the question, where is the grounding of our primary source of identity? Is our primary source of identity grounded in partisan politics? Is our primary source of identity grounded in any particular ideology? Or is our primary source of identity grounded in the living Christ, and how that is increasingly calling us to see ourselves, others, and the creation from a changed perspective? I think that's a very deep theological question and spiritual question and relational question for us to address as leaders, so that the starting place for our conversation is not what we heard on a particular television show or radio station, but that our starting place for conversation is our best understanding as disciples of the risen one. Where does that call us to begin a conversation?
So apparently, at least one of our audience has read the book, Social Analysis, and I think is asking the question, you talk about, on the one hand, what many of us find ourselves in as a position is simply being frozen to inactivity on one extreme, but on the other extreme, having made up our minds about the truth and taking a strong position for a particular change. And what this person asks in relation to the book is for you to talk a bit about the concept of radical availability, which has to do with taking risks and being vulnerable to challenging folks with your questions. Can you talk a bit about how one follows that path?
I can speak to this just a bit. I think my hope would be that we would adopt a posture of being willing to ask radical questions with love and compassion out of our own experience of the spiral, but also to be willing to have questions asked of us that reshape how we think of things. And I'll give you an example. So my new job is campus minister for faith, justice, and solidarity at Rockhurst University. And one of the parts of my job is to work with an intentional living community that focuses on eco-spirituality and sustainability. And they're college students, they're very busy. We have this garden that we're trying to get up and running, and we're supposed to meet every week to kind of like pray and talk about different topics. And it is insanely hard to get everybody to be able to meet together. And part of that is because half of the group works 30 hours a week so that they can go to school. And they work and go to school, and that's it. And it falls along racial lines within the group that we have. So the students of color are the ones who are working 30 hours a week, and then they go to school, and they don't have time. They don't have the luxury of time to gather with me in an hour that's during the day to be able to plant seeds for our organic garden. And it has confronted me with my own privilege of how I had time in college to think about these things. And I have time now to think about these things because I am afforded that privilege. And so my hope is that we would continue to ask really difficult questions, but also be confronted with questions that broaden our perspective.
I just, thanks for sharing that, Emily. I also just put a quote in the chat from the book, that radical availability is the stance in which we make ourselves utterly available for what might be asked of us. With Jesus as our model and guide, God's reign as the vision we too seek to manifest. And I think for Simperman, and oh my, there's so much in this book that we really wish we could have gotten to that we just didn't have the time for. So I appreciate this question. It really goes back to the question earlier about agenda and our starting point, that radical availability is us being willing to say that we want our deepest desire to align with God's deepest desire, that is our foundational primary mode of operating. And we know that it takes practice to get there. In the Christian discernment tradition, that is the same stance as spiritual freedom or holy indifference, that creating a space where we say as disciples, your will be done on earth, God, not mine. What does that kind of radical availability look like when we're talking about climate disruption? What does it mean to say, your will be done on earth, God, not mine, in the midst of climate, racial, any other kind of injustice that we're dealing with? That is the stance of radical availability that is essential for our discipleship to cultivate if we desire for our faith to be living and real.
Thank
I
you.
just wanted to briefly mention too that I think that we suffer from two things in our culture. One is soundbite culture, which is we grasp at simple, quick solutions, sometimes to problems that are deep and complex and require a level of commitment together to hang in there with each other and to not answer the question in the first time we sit down to have a conversation about it, but to live with the question together, to pursue the question together. And to me, part of radical availability is to be able to rise above this deeply embedded dualism that's a part of our culture. And our conversations are not about win-lose, but our conversations are about approaching the process with a learning posture. And if we don't have to conquer a conversation when we come together, but if we can truly approach conversation and engagement and pursuit of questions from a posture of learning, it can totally change the conversation and our availability to one another.
So we are now at our ending time. I'm going to just pose one more question, not for you to answer, but to, I think, leave as a reflection. And it's a theological one, as you pointed out, Katie. You know, what was the purpose for which animals were created? But someone else asked, are plants different from animals when we're talking about eating them? And I think let's simply leave that as a question that we carry away without trying to answer it in this moment. And so, Rod, are you going to be closing out with comments about where we are and where we go next?
Yes, if Zach can bring that final slide up. I just want to remind, this was a wonderful, just sort of sketch. I think we ended on a wonderful summary of the possibilities of this method that was introduced. And that was the whole intention. You can't do a deep dive in 90 minutes, but you can make us all aware of the potential of this scheme, this model to really engage in any issue, quite separate from it being a food issue, an energy issue, and oil versus renewables or whatever. It's the essence of it being a resource and a tool. In terms of the discussion, well, that's why we have always had two further discussions. Now, they are identical. You can choose the one or the other, but this allows us, for anyone interested and able to make these sessions, to go deeper, to say, yeah, what about this? He talked about economics, but it's always economics versus jobs, how to get around that, or all of these other questions that swirl around this. This was just a fabulous introduction, and these discussions allow us to dig a little deeper. So on the screen, you can see them. This coming Thursday and this coming Sunday. On Thursday, it will be in the evening, if that suits your time better. And on Sunday, back in the afternoon, same time as it was today. So consider those if you're able to make it. Wow, we can really go places with this. Emily will basically be in charge and looking to shape in more deeply the advocacy aspect of it. But that's what we're all about. We're not here simply to talk about climate change, but to gather the resources and then engage with each other, with ourselves, engage with each other, with our church, with our community, the entire globe, and naturally with God's good spirit. And it's with that God's good spirit that has been with us, that has formed us, and that continues to call us, that we go forth from this session. Thank you all for your giftedness, and may God bless. Thank you, and good evening.